breath.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to NZ Funds Connects. I'm James Greger, Chief Investment Officer for NZ Funds, and every week we're taking the opportunity to bring you a variety of perspectives on financial markets, financial advice, and developments here at NZ Funds. It is Monday, 13th of September at 9 a.m. Over the years, we have kept our approach to new investment opportunities relatively simple. If an asset offers both the opportunity of a return and safeguards against a total loss of capital, we will consider it as a candidate for an investment. This has led us to invest in things such as commodities, cryptocurrencies, and technology stocks. And today we discuss clean technology and clean energy and its place in the portfolios. But first, I'm really pleased to welcome Andrew Hoare, CEO of Auckland Blues, to NZ Funds Connects. Andrew started his career with Canterbury and the Crusaders, nothing held against him for that one, as the performance manager and conditioning coach. And during this time, Canterbury won the Ranfurly Shield, NPC, and the Crusaders became the first super team to go through a season unbeaten. Andrew was then Wales National Rugby Conditioning Director and was part of the 2005 Grand Slam winning team. And then prior to becoming CEO of the Blues, Andrew was CEO of Ospreys Rugby and CEO of New South Wales Rugby. Andrew, it's great to have you on this morning, and we were just discussing before we went live, I guess, that investing in sport and business really, has a lot of similarities. You were just telling me about a meeting you were on just before you came on this, talking about database management, which is something I never thought a rugby CEO would be talking about. But I think in all business, everything has a lot of connections and a lot of similarities. But perhaps before we dive into some of the really interesting things I think we're going to talk about this morning related to that, perhaps you could talk us through how you got to where you are, because coming from a pretty successful player down in Otago to being the CEO of one of the best franchises in the world. A lot of people's dream job and I guess dream career in terms of the sector that you're in. Maybe you could talk us through it, because I'm sure it's not all easy.
No. Look, it definitely wasn't easy, because actually I didn't come from the business side. I came from the high performance side, and like anything, right from I remember the first sort of job review I had with Steve Chu, and ultimately, and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want your job." And that's when he was Crusader and Canterbury CEO, and from there, people like him were a fantastic support to me. They knew where I wanted to go, and then it was packing the rest of that skill set that I didn't have around, and there was a couple of key turning points. People were a bit surprised when I left NZR from the high performance role, but I knew that by going to the Ospreys, they had a plan where they were going to take me through to Chief Operations Officer and CEO, and I'll always be indebted to Roger Blythe, who was the chairman then, who stuck to his word and taught me a lot. And around, at the end of the day, it's like any other business. You have a product, you have a developmental pathway, and you have to manage and market that and manage people. Where people often fall over when they come from the business side is it's very much stakeholder management led, and it's a real people business, often with high performing achievers, though, that can bring its own challenges.
I really want to talk about what you think where the game's going in general. But before we touch on that, I think as someone that used to sit in the south stand of Eden Park with Grandma, week in, week out. Almost got a little touch boring in the 90s as the Blues won, most games that you went to. And then the walk home with a bit of confidence on your shoulders as you head home to start the rest of the week. It's been a long time between drinks and in the franchise, and I guess it's not through lack of talent, I wouldn't have thought, or perhaps lack of financial support, but somehow things didn't come together until now. And this year, and even last year as well, you really, and I'm not a massive knowledgeable rugby person. I certainly like my rugby, but you could really sense a culture shift in the franchise. Can you talk us through what you identified and what happened and how you got to this year?
Yeah. Oh, look, I think there's a number of, like a lot of things, there's a number of little pieces that go into that. And it starts with the people and having that right people on board. And there was a decision made in around Leon and the changing of Leon. But Tana stayed on, and we're incredibly indebted to Tana for that, because what he did was the way that he sat in behind Leon and supported him and accepted that was pretty special. So I think there's a couple of things out of that, is getting the right people on the bus and then putting them in the right seat. It's an old adage, but there's a lot of truth in that. I think, but before that though, there'd been a reshaping of the board, and I'm not blaming the previous board at all, because I'm just saying it's the parts, and with that came probably a fresh outlook and a view that there needed to be, a fish rots from its head, so basically that there needed to be an aligned approach with our provincial unions in and around the way that we're going to manage and run the organisation, and having the right people there is important. We've all subsequently changed the majority of the leadership and management team, which has brought sort of a freshness to things, and then from there, an aligned approach. There's an analogy in sport and around the chairman, the CEO, and the coach being aligned, the 3 C's, and I think we've achieved that. And where we're going, there is still some tension points. Often the team get very cocooned in being the team. They see themselves that core, that everything is traded off. And I think, speaking to the high performance manager from New Zealand Cricket, the biggest transformation shift they had to do was getting the team to understand that they're part of something broader. And I think we're just at that phase now where we've got people starting to understand that they're part of a bigger picture, they're not the picture. And within that, they're playing for something bigger than just themselves. So we're sort of not there yet right now. We had a glimpse of it, as you said, last year, and people sort of got a taste of it. But if you notice at the beginning of this year, we waned a little bit, and we got in that typical habit of where you see teams that are lacking self-confidence and they start to get a new dawn, and then it falls away. Now, luckily, the season, and there's always a little bit of an element of luck, the season helped us because it had a definitive break period where we could go back to analysing or judging ourselves against those value set. And the piece that came out of that was we felt as an organisation and as a team that there wasn't enough accountability. And so then it's teaching young men about, well, how do I keep my mate alongside me accountable when I'm on the firing line out there in front of 40,000 people, or from day to day at training, is keeping that intensity. Because I think, speaking to Dan Carter when he left, we really wanted him to stay another year because of the leadership that he offered. He didn't need to play. He was great in the environment. But he felt he just could not at super level. In Japan, he could sort of go away, let his body recover, come out and play. But at super level, the trainings, etc., are so fast and vigorous and intense that he just couldn't keep up during the week. And as a champion, he struggled with that, and the concept of not, because he saw that as not leading. So they're the kind of conversations we're now starting to have, and you're moving away from so much of the technical, tactical to really driving that environmental aspect to get day in, day out performance.
How do you go about it in practice? Because I guess you're not going to be, and I'm guessing, but you're not going to be overly successful by getting a group of pretty impressive, driven sportsmen into a room and getting up a PowerPoint slide and talking about accountability. So,
Yeah.
So how is the concept actually shared with them, and how do you teach that?
Yeah, that's well, this is where we're still, as an organisation, not quite at the races yet. Because if you look at the good organisations, they have to often start with these basic principles when the players are very, very young and start to have that first engagement. Where we're starting is where we believe we have to teach some of the boys around this concept at a later age, and now we're pushing down some of those concepts and as we build our pathway, which starts with actually keeping young people in the pathway that you want to keep. And we were probably losing or not focused enough on what the characteristics were, the ones we wanted to keep. So I'll give a couple examples to explain that. So you're so right, and around, these people are doers. They're not academics. Some of them are very, very bright, don't get me wrong, but they're people, they're doers. They're not classroom based. Where we've sort of moved to is we've talked to them about the work environment being a place where they connect, and within that we enable them to come up with the answers to these problems. And it takes longer, but it actually, with these younger people, works really well. So we have a thing called the cafe, but the cafe, if you go into a lot of sporting organisations, or obviously an air hockey thing or a table tennis, we took all of that out, and we said, and we set it up in such a way with tables that they can look at their screens, etc., where they come in and they can have their coffee, they can have their breakfast, etc., but it's they're talking around the work and what they need to do to raise their standards, for example. And you assess then who's engaging in that kind of behaviour, who isn't, who's coachable and changeable and might be able to adapt into that environment, because some of these young men don't come from an environment where there's even a computer to do analysis, let alone thinking about turning it on and actually talking about what's on it. So it's progressing these young people into that position. And then sometimes you have to make that decision, which may not be a long-term outcome. So I'm thinking this year we've had to release a couple of young wingers, but we've brought in Bryce Heem now, a 32-year-old that's, they get tired in the leg as they get a bit older, particularly out wide. But it's actually, for those two that we've had to let go, we've brought Bryce in because he has leadership attributes and can actually teach another 5. And he'll probably be utilised in our pathway and the developmental pathway as well. So, and they're often not the heroes that you think are the ones that are driving the team. I'll give you another example, and so much of it is just the sociology of the whole environment. Is people look at Patrick Tupolotu and say, he must be a great captain, he's been at the head of this, and he has. But where he found it hard this year was not having James Parsons there, because James Parsons is that old head that often tells the boys what they don't want to hear, whereas Patrick is the guy, he'll say it, and he'll mop up in and around some things, conversations, but he needed that hard edge of James. And all of those kind of decisions are things that we often end up speaking about at a team level, and more importantly, though, in the broader organisational context.
I guess what you're saying then is these things don't happen overnight, and it's something that's obvious, and it's something that you have to work towards and be constantly adapting. What do you set out, therefore, as CEO? Is it as simple as going, our aim is to win the competition, or actually when you think about the goals of the organisation, what you're actually trying to achieve, is it a bit more complex than that? And when you go and sit there with your senior leadership team at the start of every year, as NZ Funds do, as people on the webinar who run their own businesses do, everybody's got, things they're trying to achieve in order to get to the big thing. But I guess you've got this competition that you're trying to win. Is it as simple as that, or how do you think about goal setting?
Yeah, look, and the last 18 months have been really interesting, because a lot of it, this time last year, we were effectively facing insolvency with, it wasn't until the end of the competition where some serious money come in, that we're basically in survival mode. So where I started in just the December 2019, and we had all these grand plans of bringing our strategy to life, etc. But I'll be completely honest with you, so much of it in the last 12 months has been just trying to survive and on the hop, while having a sort of a hazy vision with the senior management and the board on where we're going. All right, and that's what. So where we've ended up is, and we're just in a place at the moment, is one thing that we definitely lacked here was a real sense of purpose and drive, and actually having that awkward, hard conversation. And it's almost becoming a little bit cliche now, but we turned it Blue Pride, and Blue Pride is about the opportunities that we create for people, the inclusive nature of our club. We've actually got a really proud history, as you alluded to, but it had become a little bit tarnished with, and so how do we regrow that pride? What are the basic fundamentals? And within that, success is important, right? You can't run away from the fact that you've got to win. You've actually got to front that and actually embrace it. So we've gone about it describing, and to get that Blue Pride, you need really strong connections. So some of the things we've done over the last year, I think people know about the food pass on the drops, and the more getting out there with our clubs, etc., and our boot drive and those kind of things are all part of building the pride. And the team talk about this thing called Blue Everywhere. And Blue Everywhere is what they want when people are talking in the taxis again around the team, that people are turning up in blue. There's a real sense of pride. Now we're getting into the how, and we believe there are four main pillars. It's just like any strategic plan, and it's just living that day to day. It's probably a little bit more passion, and you are attached to the scoreboard every week in the public's mind. So it's a really fine balancing act between getting that team, if you give an example, getting it winning and performing that people feel attached to, and then at the same time going hell for leather in the background, putting in those systems and processes around high performance development. We've got a goal of not relying on ticket revenue in the next 5 years. Okay, so why is it that we generated 3.2 million less than the Crusaders in any given year? All right, so so then you're going back to that, and then deep roots into the community, questioning ourselves on, okay, so we get these guys for 7 months a year, how do we best utilise them to create those connections? And now we're talking about a charitable trust and some other modes that can drive a leadership and philosophy and what's important to us, and undertake that and diversify that could potentially enable us to support more people into the community, that creates greater connections, which creates greater relationships with commercial partners. So it all interlinks, and I don't think there's too much different to what anyone who's watching this podcast will be dealing with. The difference is what can take you off track is that scoreboard every week, because the scoreboard every week, people soon and straight, you can be doing the most wonderful things front of house, back of house, but ultimately you're there to succeed, and you've got to. Sometimes I get a bit lost in the wider business piece, and you've got to come back to that. That ultimately is that makes a lot of that so much easier if you are being successful.
Do you think that some of the other organisations around the country, Crusaders is probably best one to use as an example, do you think their success comes from what you're talking about and having that implemented? Because I guess when you reflect on the Blues, it's not about talent, because the talent's got to be there somewhere, in the sense of it's a big district and there's some incredibly talented players within that. And so do you think the journey that the Blues are going on is one that, say, Canterbury has gone on, but are perhaps a little bit ahead? Or is it, is that something, when you see other franchises doing well, something that you think a lot of that can be replicated? Or you see what happened with the women's rugby, and especially at the Olympics, and some of the things that they've been able to achieve from just getting support behind them? Or is every franchise different? Everything has their own demons and strengths and weaknesses. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think you've got to find your own path first and foremost, but there's some basic fundamentals which are really important in getting that alignment. And you see it too, right? So much of this is about people and people ownership, because our churn, if you like so next year, the last year we had 14 new players in our squad. So you've got to get them up to speed really quickly. Trying to hold on to that talent is really important. I mean, a big part of where we're going at the moment is that we've got a coach that aligns to the ethos and the philosophy of the business. Now, one of the biggest things that I worry about right now is, if Leon goes, where do we go? Now, I know I've got the generation beyond after Leon. To 2 generations' time, I've got a great group of young coaches coming through. I've got a wee hole potentially if he goes in 23. So a key part of it definitely is people understanding who you are. And I think a big issue for the Blues was they had this churn of head coaches, and one of the smart moves was actually keeping Tana in alongside so he could explore, because he's on the right track, right? But the poor guy was stretched 1,000 different ways, in the way that the structure was set up, that it didn't allow him to focus on something. So having that, you've got to find your own journey and what it is for you. There's no use choosing somebody else's why or finding it in a different way. You've got to bring it to life yourself. And so many of our conversations, you may plagiarise the other thing and see a great idea, but if it doesn't resonate with your people, you're shot to bits. So the biggest thing I've learned is actually, it takes a lot longer, is socialising those ideas and letting it be others within the organisation. And we will then start to see people that come through, they have a really clear understanding, they're telling the story to others about it, and then they bring it through. And that's where I think organisations like the Crusaders are at this present point in time. I still think they've got an issue coming up if then they lose Razor Robertson, who's next, and their biggest challenge will be the day that they have to appoint probably a head coach from outside of their region. And you've seen that in other organisations. If you look at Leicester, for example, they had this really good thing going, and they made a couple of small changes in their senior management and exec team, which upset the balance on what they had. And now they're just starting, they're having to rebuild again. And so that's where I do applaud the NZRU, because they've been able to actually keep that moving. And I know people criticise if it's an Ian Foster or coming through and those kind of things, but there are merits to holding that onto that IP and how you re-inject that, particularly if you're trying to make something your own and not plagiarise it, copy something else.
Just before we talk about the game in general, how do you do some of this implementation, say in your previous roles, when there's, people joke about cultural differences, but if you're sitting at, heading up Ospreys or New South Wales or working in the senior management team of the Wales national side, I guess, how do you get buy-in when you're a Kiwi coming over? You perhaps don't have that sort of, I don't want to say nationalist, I didn't grow up with this team, so, what do you know? Did you ever come across that sort of pushback?
Yeah, I think Ospreys was interesting in that Ospreys was they were hemorrhaging cash, right? And so the key point was, first and foremost, again, what were they there for? And there was a split between the Galacticos that they wanted to be and spending money and backing themselves to make finals, etc., which was where they were starting to fall over, versus having a deep, rich vein of talent in their own area and taking that longer-term approach of how do we bring that through, how do we keep the kids like the Alan Wynne Joneses and Justin Tippericks, etc. And so that was, for me, it was a really interesting one, because boards can be split and their motives can be split. And for some, they want to have that moment of that full state, and they'll buy buy that team, they'll do whatever it takes to get that moment, not understanding how they get that longevity. And as a CEO of a sporting organisation, you've got to get some form of consensus quickly, and then you as the person needs to make that decision whether that fits for you or not. Right? And I think what I learnt with the Waratahs in New South Wales was it seemed to be that there wasn't a consensus. I felt we'd left, we had a commercial base which was really strong. We'd signed an agreement with state government that underpinned the commercial powerhouse of the organisation. We had a really good mix of youth and experience, but there was the why wasn't to me wasn't clear enough for a high performance sport, and I think there was other factors too that meant that organisation didn't quite suit what I stood for, and so you make a decision then, don't you? It's like anything. Whereas at the Ospreys, that those discussions, those debates were able to be had, and so there was clarity on direction. And that makes things, like any business, for the CEO, really important. But again, it's that scoreboard in the stadium. You've got to be able to explain what you're doing, where you're going, what you're trying to achieve, and you've got to get that alignment amongst the business and find the right people to deliver it.
Well, that's a really good, I guess, segue into you've got all these targets around winning, and which is obvious, but one of the key aspects of why that's important is because of the financial security of an organisation. Perhaps we could talk about that in more general terms. Before we went on air, we talked about some of the key things that are probably going to drive the game as a professional game going forward, and you talked about things like staying relevant in society, governance, the financial implications. Can you give us your views on where you think some of these things are heading? And I think that will probably allow us to touch on things like the 12s that have been sort of recently announced and what that means, and perhaps delving into a bit of what the future of the game looks like.
Yeah, look, I think it's a full contact sport. So I think as the sport progresses, what we've got to see is, either we have supersized squads that can be rotated to enable us to take that much impact over the course of a year or a season, or we're going to have to become, as American football's become, a really short, high-intensity hit of entertainment. And those are the choices that are currently having to be decided. I think it's a sport at the moment that largely, in some ways, is living beyond its means, and that puts itself under some pressure as a full-contact sport. And something that we need to consider moving forward. I think what you're asking to see is that rugby at the moment in its economic evolution is saying we need more content, and that means we need bigger squads and more players produced. If I look at where Super Rugby's at right now, I think it's struggling to understand its place within the world. It hasn't got the company structure of a Japan or the larger philanthropic sort of structure of France. Now, that comes with pros and cons. I think whatever we do, where we are wanting to go is that, first and foremost, there was some key economic drivers for us in changing the competition structure, playing in our own time zone, introducing teams that had meaning and people could attach to. Those kind of things really, really important. But then it's got to be attached to something broader. And where we've looked to go in this new structure is enabling us to have a structure that goes to a World Club Championship in some way, shape or form in 2024. And the reason we feel that's important is that's one of the advantages as a club game that rugby has, that it is a global sport. And how many young men and women, their first experience is actually going somewhere overseas is often through sport, and rugby has no different. Or going overseas and getting a job when you arrive in London, which is, maybe just turning things over in a bar, and you end up going to the rugby club and you get opportunities, and you end up in something far broader than that. And that's the joy of sport. So we believe that the competition needs to be attached to something far more meaningful, far bigger, so that the Blues one day can play Leicester, at Eden Park, for example. So those kind of things we believe are important. The issue we have is we've got limited time pressure, and the issue we have is we're a full contact sport. So then we're going to have to think about how do we raise the value of that proposition while potentially decreasing the amount of product that we're putting out. And that's in the next sort of crossroads. I even look at the 12s, and I think where I think it's smart, it's a 3 weeks window, probably less contact, more space, etc. The issue you've got is we're putting competition on top of competition. So are we better to go more like, as you see in T20, and just have our players moving around the world playing in various shorter competitions, which will engender greater excitement when it does arrive. But then how do you keep relevance at that market until the circus comes to town again? So these are all of the kind of machinations at the moment. I think Super Rugby's in a good place to exploit that, because traditionally we have kept the competition shorter. It's one of the beauties of this competition is it's not 9.5-month grind like it is in the UK. And I think, you've got to ask the question, is the sport preparing itself for the future and the way that society is going to look in the next 5 to 10 years' time, and what young people and the public more broadly are looking for.
Do you think the game's in any sort of trouble in the sense not, there's still it's still the biggest sport in the nation in terms of, financially. I'm not sure in terms of juniors how many are playing rugby now though versus say other sports, and then when we first met we talked about not even really sports but sort of online sports and these sorts of things. Is this something that you think, when you think more broadly about rugby in New Zealand, are there some aspects of it that we think it could be in a bit of trouble? Maybe that's because it's contact sport, and given some of the stories that are coming out of it. At the same time, and I'm not necessarily asking you to comment because I know it's a very sensitive topic, but you've got the certain amount of buyout of the All Blacks by private equity organisations and things, and for what seems like a huge amount of money, and so it can't be in that much trouble, can it, if you're doing deals like that? So how do you see the game in terms of its just place in the New Zealand psyche?
Yeah, I think look, there's a number of parts to that. Yes, it may be in strong economic health from time to time, but the simple fact of the matter is what people are looking for and its relevance to New Zealand, I think, is at risk. And there's a number of parts that I see that we need to get that right, and that starts with the little people and how we're communicating and presenting the game to those young people and their parents. I think the union should be applauded for some of the initiatives they've brought in recently, but because the governance of our sport is so layered, if you like, often change like that can be slow in coming. It is not embraced, and it has a tendency sometimes for things to come out of left field and can be somebody's opinion that creates a movement as opposed to what's actually right. And the other thing that I have noticed is if people are coming in with different ideas that do have sound logic and or sound evidence that it'll work, that there is almost a tendency for people to say it's all right, nothing needs to change here, and the way that the numbers are being inflated at the moment is often through the growth and booming in the girls and women's game, which I think is great. because that's engaging an audience that traditionally rugby has always embraced, but it's embracing them in a different way. And so how do we make the sport, and I think the game will derive benefits from that, but when that moment comes, when that young person goes down to that club or that sport, how do we embrace the volunteer and the parent? And having a 6-year-old myself and seeing a really good club in action is great, but I still feel for the coach, if you like, because I'm wondering how much support they are actually getting. So where is that level of investment going to? So from that end, I think there is issues. If you look at it now, rugby is still the number one followed sport in those 24 and above, but basketball now is number one for 24 and below. So, yeah, and a lot of that, though, is we actually have not marched, and I think we're talking about it this morning with regard to the way that we're marketing the team, is how are we talking to our customer, how are we talking to our fan, what kind of experience are we giving them? If you look at the evolution of where we play, New Zealand in particular needs investment into that capital infrastructure. You know, people want ease, they want to turn up and they want to ensure that they can get the pizza for the kids quickly, they can go to a bar close by so they can get a beer, they can get down there, they can get potentially served at their seat, they can get their Wi-Fi. The game is more than just the game. There's a show to keep the kids occupied at half time and beforehand, and they want transport in and out really quickly. Now, that sounds great, and then they want to be spoken to at a level that they want to be spoken to during the week and keep connected, and that's going to take investment, and that's going to take us changing some of the more traditional ideas that we have in and around the game, while also giving that experience that you talked about of, you know, at the end of the day, you're there with your nana. You're probably getting your pie. It was easy to come and go, and you're having a great day out, you know. So it's that real mix that, and we're just at this stage, I think we've just got a bit tired. And so what we're talking about is with this new super competition, how do we actually start engaging with that fan far more effectively? And is why I'm a big advocate for a new stadium, because I think you need to have an environment that's sort of says to you where you want your community to go. And to me, I think rugby should be a place that should be accessible to all. It should be mixed with really good social habits, so families going and sharing food and eating together, being able to go into a high-stakes stadium and having a great experience, and then go home to talk about it for the rest of the week and be talked to. So, but you will end up getting into a debate about the history and the traditions and the holding on to it. You still can, you just got to deliver it in a different way.
As I reflect, Andrew, I live close by to Eden Park, and that's probably why it's front and centre. But so we're walking around the daily walkers around the stadium with my two boys, both under 4, both their parents grandparents are Northern Irish from a hardcore rugby family, and you think when I was going to that stadium when I was 7 or 8 and eating hot chips and a pie with grandma, it feels like nothing has changed in that sense. And maybe for me that's a fantastic thing, but maybe that's not what kids are and families are after, and perhaps it's just at the moment easier to stay at home and still watch it, but watch it on telly and you talk about gate take and that not relying on that as being a part of the driver of your revenue and your business. That's incredible compared to 30 years ago.
Yeah, very much so. I think we're looking at a world. Well, there's a couple of things here. Let's talk about Ulster. Where your family from? I think they've done a wonderful job. They rebuilt their stadium to a 16,000 little seater stadium, which is easily accessible in and out. But they've kept the traditional bar at the end with the old tent with a pint. So you've got to get that mix between that smell, that thing that makes you want to bring the kids along because it's what you did, but also give them the Wi-Fi and the experience they need. And it's getting that mix is really, really important. I've lost my second point there, but and then it's that engagement afterwards. It's that heroes. It's the values of the game, and how do we then connect in with those kids so that, and with the adults, that it's still relevant. I mean, the fastest growing population in Auckland is of Indian, Sri Lankan part of the world and descent. How are we appealing to those people when they come here? How are we opening our doors to them? And I think AFL have done some really cool things in making new New Zealanders, or new Australians in their case, feel a part of that, and that there's a safe point of entry. I think rugby's got so much to offer in breaking down a lot of the social barriers that we see when immigrants come. But we just have to help the volunteers on the tools on how to do that. And it's the same with our stadia and the service and things that we're providing. And I think at the end of the day, it is still about people connecting and having an experience. That doesn't change. But what might change is the way that we deliver that experience around them. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, that's been a really fascinating discussion. I just think it's fascinating that you can have these sorts of conversations about sport. But that's New Zealand. New Zealand is a country where sport is big business, but it also is the thing that gets the community together. And look how full Eden Park was after the last lockdown when things finally opened up. It was truly great to see that many people heading along to the rugby, and I'm sure we'll get that again, maybe cricket this time because it's the wrong season. But I think there's a lot of change going on, and it's really interesting to get your take from it, especially within an organisation that's obviously, now I'm biased, but doing great things for Auckland and really succeeding in it. And I guess it's definitely one to watch. Maybe our kids will be walking around the new stadium down in the waterfront, hopefully. But lots of things to think about and lots to watch. And thanks very much for your comments. It's greatly appreciated.
No, thanks for having me on, James. And hopefully it's been some food for thought anyway, particularly at these times where we've hopefully got a bit of time to chew the fat in the evenings.
Absolutely. Well, good luck motivating the guys to keeping fit during lockdown. And,
yes.
And take care and look forward. Love to chat again soon and talk about how things have progressed. Hopefully with another season win under the Auckland belt.
Yeah, we're definitely hoping for that. A lot of work to do. Thank you.
Take care. Cheers.
Cheers.
Well, we're going to take quite a sharp turn from Auckland Blues rugby and sport to a quick look into what we're currently looking at within the portfolios, just to, I guess, give an insight into some of the things that we're investing in that are, I guess, slightly different from your traditional technology shares and utilities shares in New Zealand and the US. And I think the reason we wanted to write the investment insight around our investment into clean energy and discuss quickly how we've done that is because it is not something that we've just jumped on in the last couple of weeks, given the excitement that's going on in the Twitter sphere on clean energy. Actually, it's something that we've been working on for the last 6 or 7 months. So if I rewind back to the investment insight that we published last week or week before last, and then we talked about the turning point in the growth and inflation portfolios. It's early days. It's only been a few weeks, but we've really noticed some of the performance bounce back. And why has that happened, and what's been the driver? Well, one of the driver has been our investment into clean energy, and why that's been a success is because it's very uncorrelated to what's going on in the broader share market. So let's delve really quickly into the clean energy investment case. So I guess we all know about decarbonisation, and the world really has committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. But at the same time, the world economy is growing, led by developing countries, China, India, but also you've got some big economic bounce backs post-COVID, but also into the developed countries. And so that growth, you need electricity and energy. And we all know the story that can't be driven by coal-fired stations. And in fact, in some countries, New Zealand included, gas-fired power stations also are creating a lot of the carbon output that we're trying to restrict. And so really the focus is now on the energy that is the most cleanest and sustainable, and that's nuclear energy. And so what you've seen is the United States, China, and the European Union looking at nuclear as the crucial tool in achieving sustainability objectives. It's one of the most cheapest, most reliable forms of energy. In fact, there are now 54 reactors under construction in the world at the moment, with another 96 planned. And so as New Zealanders, if we all cast our minds back, some of us have to perhaps watch replays on YouTube rather than remember it outright, but the David Lange speech at the Oxford Union about nuclear. And plus you've got more recent events like the Fukushima nuclear disaster. There is concern that nuclear energy has its dangers. But I guess in the wake of Fukushima, have seen some massive technological advances made in nuclear energy, making it significantly safer. And so you are getting widespread support for nuclear technologies. And even Bill Gates is talking about it being developed in smaller size that's able to be scaled through developing countries to help them with their energy reliability. So what does that mean, and what are we investing in, and how are we seeing this as an opportunity for portfolios? Well, the setup is called the Uranium Deficit. So currently the global fleet of nuclear reactors use about 175 million pounds of uranium a year to function. And estimates show that the current supply is around 140 million pounds. That's a big deficit. In any market, if that deficit existed in oil or natural gas or cotton or lean hogs, or you name the commodity, the price of that commodity would increase substantially. For uranium, it's a bit of an opaque market. There is not much price discovery because really there's only one certain type of buyer, and that's the utilities of these power companies. And utilities who buy uranium are generally some sort of quasi-government owned, not massively commercially orientated. And if they are, actually the cost of uranium within the bigger picture of a nuclear reactor is actually really small. So prices increasing aren't as much of a concern as, say, the infrastructure costs of building a new reactor. So what you have seen, given that deficit, is an increase in uranium price of around 30% in the last few weeks. But given the deficit, and given that a lot of the mines that mine uranium are closed for various reasons, mainly because of the 10 years of very low prices, but also some short-term reasons such as COVID, we're expecting that the price of uranium to increase dramatically more than just the 30% increase we've currently seen. So it's currently trading at about $40 US a pound. And there's some believers that think it could go to as high as $100 a pound, and even some suggestion $200. Now that 200 is probably getting slightly extended, and we think we still see some pretty decent upside, but perhaps a little bit more conservative than some of the real bulls out there. Even so, this provides an interesting opportunity. But what about ESG? The way that you access uranium predominantly is through investing in mining companies, but we'll also touch on another way we can access it. But in mining companies, there's always issues around ESG, whether that be labor conditions, whether that be the actual extracting the commodity out of the ground. Well, I think what you have seen is a real increase in support for ESG around how these miners operate. Given it is somewhat of a sector with oversight from governments, a lot of the corporates are taking much more responsibility in how they develop their new mining techniques and limiting their environmental impacts. So all the mining companies that we do have looked to invest in have passed our independent ISS ethic, which is our independent ESG checker within the sector, which is really pleasing. At the same time, there's probably concerns amongst those that think, what about uranium for military purposes? Well, Canada, where most of the uranium is produced, actually stopped supplying uranium for military purposes way back in 1965. And in fact, Canada's policy of selling uranium only for peaceful purposes is part of one of Canada's international treaty obligations that they signed in 1970 when Canada ratified the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. So a lot of the uranium being produced by miners and especially that from Canada are certainly not going into any sorts of weapons or any sort of use other than for nuclear energy. So how do we invest in it? Well, this deficit in uranium makes the price trajectory of uranium really exciting. The one way that you can easily get access to it is by buying these uranium producers. And so the likes of Cameco or NextGen, which are companies that mine uranium. And with increasing in prices, they are expected to, have a higher profitability target given the increase in commodity price. The other way you can access uranium is through uranium options. So that's buying an option where you can purchase and the ability to profit if the price goes up. But the great thing about buying an option is you limit your downside risk. And so if the price of uranium doesn't increase to the extent that we expect, you've limited the amount that you have exposed to those prices. And the reason why this is really exciting is because options are really common. For those of you that have been with NZ Funds for a while, you'll remember we bought the same sort of options for the S&P 500 back in the market drawdown in March 2020. So the market came down a lot. We thought it was a fantastic buying opportunity, but there was a lot of uncertainty within the market around what share markets are going to do and what the effects of COVID were going to have on those markets. So the way that we could be aggressive in buying back into the share market, especially the S&P 500 in the US, is to buy options. If the price of the share market went up, New Zealand Funds clients would benefit. If they didn't, the way that options work is your downside is limited. And that proved a really successful strategy and one that clients really benefited from. Options on the S&P 500 or the US share market are really common. Options on uranium have never ever been traded. They don't exist and they never have existed up until now. So for the last 6 months, New Zealand Funds have been working really closely with Goldman Sachs in order to create an option for the uranium market. And the reason we wanted to do this is because it's a commodity that we wanted to participate in, but also making sure that we have a good risk mitigant within that if the prices didn't move how we would expect. And after several long months of setting up the infrastructure, setting up the governance and legal requirements in order to be able to trade an option in uranium, NZ Funds were able to trade uranium options on behalf of clients a couple of weeks ago with Goldman Sachs in order to participate in this move in uranium prices. And this is something that we're really excited about. It was done with Goldman Sachs in the London, Paris office, and also New York. And New Zealand Funds were the first to be able to do this. And I think why this is so exciting is it is another example of NZ Funds giving access to international investment tools and opportunities that will make a meaningful difference to our long-term financial outcomes and performance. But also, it keeps building a local expertise within the financial markets in New Zealand. If you remember, we were the first KiwiSaver fund to invest into cryptocurrencies in September last year, and enables you to increase your knowledge base around different asset classes And when these asset classes really do start taking on momentum, it means we're a step ahead in terms of our knowledge base around how these investments trade, how they react to different news, but also how they progress as an investment and what the fundamental analysis looks like when we invest. So uranium in of itself, we really hope it works. It is starting to work at the moment, and you're seeing it as some of the drivers of performance within the portfolios. But perhaps this points to a bigger thing. Perhaps this points to something that what we're trying to achieve is making New Zealand a place where large financial organizations turn to make these investment decisions. Goldman Sachs could have gone anywhere in the world, and they chose New Zealand because of its very, very stable rule of law and regulatory environment. And that really goes to show that New Zealand is open for business, and it's a great place where a lot of capital could come and join already what's invested here in KiwiSaver and other investments to really make this a hub of the Asia Pacific region. And that's why we're excited. It's not just around the single investment, but it's also around what this means for the New Zealand financial markets. So I hope you found that insight interesting. We talked about the investment case, but also some of the challenges with uranium and how we've offset that within how to actually access it, but also ESG requirements. And so this is another one of a good example of some of the things that we're looking at. I'd hasten to add that key drivers of our portfolios, whether it's income or growth, are bonds and shares. And those are going to be the big dictators of long-term compounding returns over time. And when we think and identify investment opportunities other than the traditional asset classes, we will take advantage of those because we think in the environment that we're in, it's important to do so. Well, it was a webinar of two sides, sport and then investing, but I think a lot of them have real similarities. I hope you enjoyed some of Andrew Hoare's comments. I think it's going to be a really interesting sector and business to play out over the next few years in terms of rugby and what that means for New Zealand. For those of you outside of Auckland, please have a coffee and a burger for me multiple times this week. And for those in Auckland, I hope that we are all doing well and enjoying the cooking as much as I did over the weekend and will over the next week. Until this time next week, have a great week, everyone, and do reach out if you've got any comments or questions from this morning or any of the insights that we've published over the last few weeks. Look forward to talking again soon.